Good afternoon, everyone, or depending on your time zone, good day, good evening. Thank you all for joining us to discuss procurement in support of localization and sustainable development. My name is Noam Unger, and I'm the Director of the Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative here at CSIS, and a Senior Fellow with the Project on Prosperity and Development. We've convened this discussion to delve into an important topic. Government procurement as a whole worldwide amounts to 11 trillion per year, around 13% of global GDP. Sustainable approaches to public procurement therefore present a significant long-term economic opportunity for organizations, firms, and institutions of all sizes, and the chance to drive progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. Against the backdrop of constrained global public finances, sustainable and strategic public procurement can help maximize impact, alleviate fiscal constraints, and promote efficient use of resources. Today, leading procurement executives from UNOPS and USAID will share their experience while putting development spend to best use to increase development results, support local capabilities, ensure inclusivity, and guarantee the best and greatest impact, all while aligning with the SDGs. UNOPS is the central resource for the UN system in procurement and contracts management, as well as infrastructure projects, among other things. UNOPS delivered $3.5 billion in peace and security, humanitarian, and development projects in 2022. And USAID manages the lion's share of bilateral US overseas development assistance. And its Management Bureau's Office of Acquisition and Assistance guides the agency's obligations, surpassing $35 billion in fiscal year 2022. Procurement, localization, and sustainable approaches are all intertwined. So we are fortunate to host these two leaders here with us today to navigate the issues, and each brings a unique perspectives. Anne Claire Howard serves as the Director of Procurement at UNOPS, where she is strategically advancing UNOPS's role in sustainable public procurement and resilient supply chains. Her extensive expertise encompasses environmental, social, and governance risk management and advisory roles within both the development and private sectors, including heavy industry spanning the World Bank, Shell, the Eurasia Group, the IFC, Adam Smith International, Better Coal, and Responsible Steel. And that's a lot. Nadeem Shah is the Deputy Director for Washington Operations of USAID's Office of Acquisition and Assistance, known as OAA. Through this office, he advances USAID's development goals and enables sustainable, inclusive, and locally led development results through acquisition and assistance. Mr. Shah is an experienced procurement manager and served as the OAA director in multiple overseas USAID missions, including Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, Senegal, and Iraq, also a lot. Prior to joining USAID, Mr. Shah was a member of the United States Air Force working on contracting. I'll be turning to each of them so that they can provide some opening comments and tell us a bit about how their organizations are approaching procurement that supports localization and sustainable development. Then we'll get into some further questions, and I anticipate it will be a dynamic conversation. We were talking earlier, just before we began this conversation, about how procurement can be fascinating and is really central to all the issues that we care about. But before we get into that, I do want to mention to all of our live viewers and listeners today that if at any point you have a brief question for our panelists, please go ahead and enter it by clicking on the button that says Ask Questions. And that can be found on this event's webpage or in the YouTube description section as well. We will do our best to work those into the discussion as it progresses. All right, with that, let me hand the microphone over. Anne Claire, welcome. Please tell us how UNOPS is approaching localization and why procurement is so important for the SDGs and international development.
Thank you, Noam, and thank you for everyone online, and thank you, Nadeem, for sharing this panel with me. It's really exciting to be here, and procurement isn't usually a very appealing topic. You know, I'm surrounded by people who'd rather talk about infrastructure, development, impact, but what's the reality of the world we're in is that procurement is all that, and it is central to all that. And I'm here to talk about how procurement can truly make an impact. And I know that Nadeem will share a lot from his experience and hopefully sparking some really interesting discussions and questions from you all. Sustainable procurement or sustainable supply chains or harnessing the power of public spending is a great way to further the sustainable development goals. And this is a topic very close to my heart. Very briefly about UNOPS, the UN and procurement. UNOPS is a central procurement resource for the UN and its partners, and we've been championing sustainable development for the better part of a decade. Just a few numbers, and again, this pales in comparison to USAID's numbers. The UN procured 29 billions of goods and services last year, and UNOPS has always been in the top 5 procurement agencies. We procured last year close to 2 billion worth of goods and services, but what's really important is what this actually covers, the data behind these numbers. That is over 6,000 days of procurement technical assistance, work with over 6,000 suppliers from 160 countries, and 56% of our procurement was done with local suppliers. This is really important because we believe in making procurement not just sustainable, but one of the fundamental pathways to support our partners in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I think for me, a lot of the value in these conversations comes from demystifying what sustainable procurement actually is. There's a lot of pushback around whether it's compatible with public procurement principles of transparency, value for money, open competition. What I would like to see, and the goal we have at UNOPS, is really to make all public procurement sustainable. I would like us to stop using the word sustainable when we talk about public procurement, because by definition it should be sustainable. But key to this is adopting really a flexible and maturity-based approach. And by this, I mean not one size fits all. We have to look beyond transactional approaches and move on to strategic approaches on public procurement. And crucial to this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is around data. How do we actually measure the impact that we're having through our procurement activities, reporting, but also training and capacity building, not just for us and our organizations, but for the suppliers that we work with. Diversifying our supply chain is about giving people opportunity, whether it's women-owned businesses, young people, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, giving people a chance to prosper. And I'm happy to talk about some of these examples later on, but we've done a lot of work in this space, including very challenging locations like Yemen. We want to also ensure more effective public spending. We've talked about this. And what we focus on is how to help public procurement be more efficient, be more transparent, provide greater value for money and greater impact, and better public services for the people that we serve. Finally, I think supporting local economies, and when we talk about localization, I think this is a central theme. About 60% of our procurement in 2022 and probably more in 2023 is from local suppliers. And this covers many different aspects. Obviously, it can lessen the environmental impact by reducing emissions and directly supporting local economies. But it's also about developing the capacity of our suppliers, the suppliers we work with in challenging, fragile, conflict-affected states, to meet the social, economic, and environmental sustainability criteria that we want. Again, I think central to this, it's not about excluding people. It's about bringing people together in a common dialogue, build their capacity, target them, help them improve their performance when it comes to sustainability. I've spent the last week in Washington discussing best practices with partners from the US government, the World Bank, and others on how together we can increase our use of sustainable procurement practices to foster local solutions. And this is a really important thing. This working together, collaborating between not just public procurement institutions, but with the private sector as well, for me is one of the fundamental ways in which we can actually achieve real sustainable development impacts. And I think there's a lot more that I could say right now, but I think this is a great discussion to be having. I think it's very fortuitous that we're having it now. I think sustainable procurement is becoming central to a lot of agendas, whether you're talking about the private sector or the public sector. And given how far off track we are when it comes to the sustainable development goals or climate change, I think that we need to harness the power of public purchasing to really make an inroad on achieving the sustainable development goals.
Thank you so much, Anne-Claire, for those opening thoughts. Nadim, please let me turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Noam, and thank you, Anne Claire. I'm also very excited to be here. We don't really get this opportunity to talk as procurement professionals, and so I really appreciate the welcome from CSIS for this meeting today. Um, I would like to touch on USAID's kind of overall approach briefly, and then targeting like um, our really, I would say, challenging goals that, we're actually trying to enable. And then the challenges that we continue to face with working with local organizations and some of the things that we've done to enable those challenges and try to move our localization efforts more forward. Um, the topic itself, I mean, it's very challenging. These are very challenging topics and issues to work through. And as Anne Claire had mentioned, and I want to also echo that, nothing in our business happens without procurement. And yet, it doesn't always get the attention that it needs. I think mostly due to people really not understanding all of the processes involved in, our work. So with that said, I'd just like to just go over briefly USAID's three overarching priorities to drive progress through and beyond our programs are to confront the greatest challenges of our time, second, to embrace new partnerships, and third, to invest in USAID's enduring effectiveness. So what do I mean by that more specifically? So given the mammoth consuming nature of the challenges we face today, whether that be a global food crisis, rapidly changing climate, threats to democracy, um, or even the lingering effects of the pandemic, our administrator is requiring us to broaden our aperture, enlist new partners, and focus on making impact beyond the scope of our programs. And how are we doing that? We're doing that through targeting our localization work, which is guided by two big top targets that were set by our administrator back in 2021. The first one being 25% of direct funding to local partners by 2025. This is a global target taking into consideration different country contexts. It is very aspirational. We have quite a road to go, but it's been very intentional that we set very high targets. The next target is also, I would say, a very high target, which is local leadership in 50% of all USAID projects by 2030. And local leadership is broadly defined, not just say specific to the leadership of an award. The challenges that we continue to face are understanding the landscape of USAID funding opportunities and the organizational capacities needed to be eligible for partnership. Having local organizations understand how to work with USAID. It's very costly to put together an application to apply for funding opportunities. It's very hard to understand our regulations. Even when a local partner is selected to implement a USAID activity, challenges can persist, such as difficulties in communicating in English on procurement regulations, which are hard to understand as it is, managing USAID reporting and compliance requirements, and one example that comes to mind is covering overhead costs adequately, which to me are pretty key to sustainability of local organizations. Training internal staff to design a funding opportunity in a way that local organizations can be competitive, which oftentimes requires the procurement workforce to use creative procurement approaches and some confidence in their ability to deal with, say, their local context that they may be new to. Reviewing the landscape of potential local organizations so we broaden that base, working to educate both internal to the organization and external audiences of how we engage communities directly, expanding on the use of inclusive and participatory approaches. So these are immense challenges, and what we try to do to worked toward these goals is first, we've updated our acquisition and assistance strategy, noting like, what we actually need to do. Our workforce is always limited. It always requires additional mentoring, guidance. Um, so this approach, which outlines the shift in our business practices, uh, is hopefully making us more flexible, more adaptable to the work that's needed to be done at the local level. Um, Updating our appetite statement, which articulates a high appetite for taking smart and disciplined risks in working with local partners. We try to inform our colleagues at USAID that as an agency, we are trying to take higher risks at the programmatic level to be able to work with local organizations in a more effective way. And then also updating our local capacity strengthening policy, which commits USA to emphasize capacity strengthening as an important outcome and approach. So quite a few updates and ongoing processes at USAID.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Nadim, and thanks, Anne Claire, both of you, for your sort of opening thoughts. You both mentioned localization as a priority towards sustainable development. And Nadim, you got into this a little bit, but I want to ask a little bit further in terms of, I think this has been very much a question for the last several years, certainly. What is local, right? What do we mean when we say local? This isn't actually as easy as a question as it might seem. What does it mean for both of your institutions, and how are you working to sort that out? And then I also have another question beyond the sort of circumference or definition of or different definitions of local. It's also, how do you balance, right, global capabilities? You are both organizations delivering services globally, and you can source in many ways globally. And we all know that the best sort of talents, if you're trying to source something, exist in all types of places. And how do you balance sort of that global scope in capabilities from which both of your institutions are able to draw, and the imperative, which is core to ultimate sustainability, of focusing locally? So, Anne Claire, I'll turn to you since we just heard from Nadim, but I look forward to hearing from you both.
Thanks, Noam. And it's a really tricky question for the simple reason, and it's going to be a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's really all about trade-offs. Ultimately, as you said, first of all, there's trade-offs and there's data. As you said, we don't really, the definition of local will shift from one organization to the next. Are we talking local suppliers, as in they manufacture locally? Are we talking distributors? Are we talking about value creation? Are we talking about local employment? There's a million ways that you could slice this up. And ultimately, it's about how well we know the suppliers that we're working with. And that knowledge can be really challenging, especially in low capacity context or in fragile countries where, the supplier base is fragile and it shifts around a lot. So knowing your suppliers is a fundamental part of that, and then determining what is local and what is global. I think it's a huge conundrum, because fundamentally it's about how we spend public money. And obviously, every taxpayer who participates in the global economy is in some way, shape, or form funding the UN's activities. And for us as UNOPS, as a demand-driven organization, we work with partners like USAID, like the World Bank, like a number of other international bodies or aid agencies, and they are recipients of public funds. And therefore, we have to fundamentally balance what is within the national interest from a funder's perspective and what is in the national interest from the recipient's perspective. And this is a perpetual set of trade-offs. And I think for me, the key thing is there's really a decision that needs to be made by institutions, and USAID has set itself targets. We as a demand-driven institution can't really do that, but our goal is to support and enable our own partners' targets. So we will do our best to deliver on the commitments that they're making in the area of localization. But ultimately, it's about how you look at risk as well. There are some areas where very clearly localization is still a huge challenge. We procure millions of dollars worth of pharmaceutical products. And yes, we would love to procure locally, but we all know that the capacity in some of the countries we operate would basically jeopardize the outcomes of our projects. So it's a perpetual balancing act between what is feasible, what is effective, what is most cost effective as well, and ultimately, what can you do in terms of local economic development through capacity building? So it's a very long-winded way of saying, ultimately it's about knowing who you work with, so you actually have an informed decision-making process, setting yourself targets, which can be done, and that helps facilitate the whole process, and then trade-offs. You have to decide fundamentally what is going to be most important in this procurement process, because sometimes a local procurement exercise may prove marginally more costly. But if you're factoring in, life cycle costs, cost of ownership, the long-term benefits to the country, they may become more impactful. And these are the choices that we have to make strategically day in and day out.
Thanks. Nadim, your thoughts?
Thank you, Anne-Claire. I would echo almost everything that you've said, and very well said. And I would just add to it that, there's defining local, and then at USAID, there's defining localization. And localization at USAID, the way that we look at it, is a set of internal reforms, actions, and behavior changes that we're undertaking to ensure our work puts local actors in the lead, strengthens local systems, and is responsive to local communities. It's informed by over a decade of experience, and it's very intentional. So we're undertaking it in different lines of effort. For example, adapting our policies and programs to foster locally led development that's tied to each country's unique political, social, cultural, economic, et cetera, environmental conditions, including through local systems, practice, and local capacity strengthening. Shifting power to local actors, including with an inclusive development lens, those from marginalized and underrepresented groups, and promoting space for them to influence, exercise leadership over priority setting, activity design and implementation, and measuring and evaluating results. Third item is channeling a larger portion of funding directly to local partners, as I've talked about our goals, while ensuring accountability for the appropriate use of those funds and the achievement of development and humanitarian results. And finally, serving as a global advocate and thought leader, using our convening power, partnerships, and voice, and other tools of development diplomacy to catalyze a broader shift towards locally led development. So easier said than done. I think, when Noam, you asked about that balance, I also have to add to what Anne-Claire said of internal capacity development, meaning this goes back to ensuring that we have the well-trained workforce that understands how to build in flexibility where needed, as well as taking on that higher risk at the programmatic level. So that comes with a lot of work up front to build relationships, to build trust, and work through challenging issues. So it's not really, it's very challenging. It's not easy. Often involves a very iterative process of learning from both sides, and also just a continuous goal setting of what are we actually trying to do? And that's very context specific. So I'm sorry I'm speaking very broadly, but this is what I wanted to add to what Anne-Claire had mentioned.
No, I appreciate that. And you referenced, I'm very familiar with the USAID context, having worked there within this past decade that you referenced, from, the buildup of local solutions and deep thinking about local systems and USAID Forward. And then, all of the work of recent years to engage new partners. And it's all coming to further fruition through the current leadership and their emphasis on very sort of prominent goals but then a lot of, challenges in defining how we're going to get there. And I understand that your agency and UNOPS, I'm sure as well, is wrestling with this as you're trying to sort of advance this agenda. Nadim, you talked a little bit about the workforce, and so I want to jump to that in part because already we have some viewers who are asking questions, and one of them actually relates to that. And then I'll circle back to some of the other issues that both of you touched on with regard to trust and consistency and flexibility. But with regard to workforce, there was a question from Chris O'Donnell from Development Essentials, who's engaging with us today. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a little bit long. It talks about some of the legislative efforts to oversee the agency and interest in questions of the number of contracting officers or agreement officers that exist to manage the amounts of funding that you manage, and puts that in contrast to Department of Defense and other parts of the US government. But essentially the question comes down to, what is your office doing to determine workforce levels for contracting and agreement oversight and recruiting and retraining? And I think that's some of what you were getting at, Nadim. So I'll start with you because you were just going to go there in your comments. And then, Anne-Claire, I'd love to hear a similar response to how you're dealing with it on the UNOPS side.
Thank you. No, not an easy question by any means. And I don't mean to date myself, but I've been in procurement for like over 20 years, and there's always been a shortage of contracting officers, even in DoD, which I was a part of before USAID. Why is that? Well, there's many reasons. I won't necessarily go into that here. I think what's more important is what are we trying to do about it? I don't think there's not a solution to it. I think it's an ongoing issue that just constantly has to be managed and understood and acknowledged. It is what it is. What we've been trying to do is try to be much more intentional about understanding our numbers, our history, trying to tell our narrative of what we need, trying to do more consistent, say, workload analysis, and then advocate for more staff, because our budgets continue to grow. We're always seeming to do more with less, and it comes with a high burnout rate. I mean, these are the realities. And so, again, like as I've said, there's not like anything that I could say that, oh, this is the solution to this. It's more a work in progress. We continue to try to make strides to increase the workforce, to balance workload. And, I guess, beyond that, just an acknowledgement that there is always a continuous shortage of trained procurement people. It's across the USG. It's not specific to USAID.
And that's a good segue over to you, Anne-Claire.
Yeah, I think you've touched on the nerve that'll get any procurement official in any organization slightly riled up, because under-resourcing is probably a trend, and under-capacitating is probably another. But for me, there's a couple of key points, and it all boils down to planning and actually being able to know what kind of resources you're going to need for whatever procurement exercise you're going to be doing. For us as a demand-driven organization, that is particularly challenging because we're highly dependent on knowing what our partners are going to expect from us next year or the year after, which makes planning relatively challenging. And everyone knows that poor planning leads to poor outcome, and it's very true about procurement as well. I think for me, one of the key areas is understanding that the complexity of procurement is not always linked to the dollar value of what you're procuring. And a lot of the time we tend to resource, projects better because they have a high dollar value, but the procurement linked to that project may actually be relatively simple and may not require, huge procurement resources to actually conduct the procurement exercises for this. Whereas you may have smaller programs with a highly complex procurement attached to it, or, let's say medical procurement, where you're going to require all sorts of quality assurance processes to back it up. And that requires technically savvy procurement officials supported by a technical workforce that understands the technical specifications of what you're procuring. And I think that's really important. But for me, the other fundamental aspect is around creating communities of practice, of people who can share knowledge and can share experience and build up the pride you have in the work that you do. And I think it's very fundamental to organizations to recognize the value that their procurement function has, and as such promote the work that their procurement officials do in the field or elsewhere. And I think that's something that we're trying to promote more, to try and encourage, our top performing, however you want to characterize them, procurement officers to share their best practice, share their experience, and not just within our organization, but really broaden the reach that we have outside. And I think the more we can collaborate on all of these things, the more we can share knowledge and experience, the more likely we are to make some progress. But to be honest, I think we could have been asked this question a decade ago and given, sadly, a relatively similar answer, because, the do more with less is not just the case for procurement. It usually tends to be the case across public services generally. But I think in the procurement function, it's probably been felt quite severely over the last decade or so.
Well, and not only that, I think the do more with less approach also has the potential to run counter to the localization agenda that both of your organizations are putting forward. It actually takes sometimes more work with sometimes smaller amounts of funds to really engage at that local level, and that can be countered by this thrust to do more with less. I want to turn, because you've both talked about a little bit about trust and flexibility in your comments as well. So, your roles in overseeing and managing procurement, and also overseeing and managing the implementation of certain rules across your institutions, right? And others that you partner with, whom you partner, lead to issues of standards, right? Standards, transparency, and regulations, they're all key to ensuring public trust. But both of your institutions also work to support projects in some of the most challenging environments in the world. And Claire, you referenced this when you were talking about fragile contexts, right? Trust is also key to partnerships with implementing organizations and consortiums and that are working in the dynamic contexts that we're talking about. So, and that side of trust requires flexibility, right? In these dynamic contexts, you're not quite sure how things are going to play out, and you need to ensure flexibility. So how do you think about these issues of trust with the public and with partners? And are there issues of balancing between layering sort of the many requirements and regulations that are associated with transparency and public trust with much needed flexibility? Nadim, I'm going to pick on you because we just heard from Anne-Claire, and then we'll keep going back and forth.
Thank you. No shortage of difficult, tough questions. So, I would say from my experience, it really comes with gaining more confidence and gaining, more experience. I think starting off as a contracting officer, just trying to understand, like, what am I actually trying to do with say this initiative or these localization efforts. And, how do I wasn't even really thinking about the, trust until later on when I realized, oh, I'm actually applying, my procurement training in a context that is completely requiring flexibility. So I'm not even building trust with these organizations. And in fact, some of my decisions are actually causing harm to their operations inadvertently. So having kind of that realization and then continuing to expand my knowledge base and working through really challenging assignments, I realized that, hey, you know what, I really I really need to be more intentional in this relationship. That takes a lot of effort. I really need to understand what's being asked of me. And I really need to engage and make decisions in a way that aren't going to be harmful to these local organizations, or any organization for that matter. And that's not easy. That didn't come overnight. That took years to develop. It may sound pretty straightforward in this conversation, but for me, it was again an iterative process that just took a lot of time. Then looking at the public trust, that comes with as much transparency as possible, being able to share our story, our narrative, oftentimes when I would say the public may not really fully understand what are we trying to do, what are we trying to achieve. At the same time, like maybe not even understanding our goals. I had a very challenging experience in my last assignment where, I was the director of the procurement office for our Afghanistan mission. And I started like the week after that historic departure from Kabul. And to me, I always thought that the decisions I was trying to make were trying to be holistic to make sure that organizations are heard, and that we're approaching this based off of, again, like not trying to be harmful to any organization's operations, even though we had mandates that were beyond like our decision making. And as transparent as I was trying to be, I felt like even in that situation, it was really hard to tell our story of our work and how it was evolving due to the nature of the situation. So that was probably the most challenging of trying to deal with that public perception. But beyond that, I think it just goes back to gaining more experience, and just developing relationships that will help enable that trust. So
yeah, thank you for sharing that, Nadim. And Claire, your thoughts on sort of big capital public trust and transparency and standards and regulations, and trust with partners and flexibility at the local level?
I'm going to echo Nadim's sentiments. These are not easy questions. I think that this is again, it's a vital, aspect of our work. Trust, whether it's trust from the public, trust from your own personnel, trust from your partners, is paramount for any organization, but even more so for a public institution. Without trust, we are very limited to achieve the goals that we set ourselves. We're spending public money basically, which have the goal of serving development objectives. And as Nadim said, transparency is a key component of trust. So this is about sharing as much information as you can, and about the information which is the right information for your partners. And it depends on your audience. I remember in my previous roles, we were obsessed with sharing a lot of data and a lot of information with every stakeholder, including, local communities and mine sites in the middle of nowhere. But very quickly, you realize that it's not about overwhelming your counterparts with information and data, because actually there you're basically hiding things, because you overwhelm your counterparts with so much information that they don't actually know what they need to know. So for me, a lot of the key things we try to address around transparency is understanding what is actually going to be helpful for your audiences. What are they trying to do with the information that you're conveying in a transparent way? And obviously, as a UN institution, we get audited by the United Nations Board of Auditors at a regular basis, who ask us for a lot of information. But this may not be the information that is worthwhile knowing to the communities we're working with in Mozambique. They probably just want to know at regular intervals, what contracts are we publishing? How can they tender for these contracts? Are we enabling them to understand the procurement processes that, as Nadim said, can be highly complex? Are we making these accessible to them? Because that's how you build the trust, is by showing that you're not just talking about local procurement, about making developing opportunities for local communities, for women-owned businesses. It's about actually enabling them to do that by building that constant dialogue, by building that trust with them. And that trust comes sometimes from literally hand holding them through processes until one business wins a tender and then says, yes, this is achievable. Look, I have done it. I'm a member of your community and I got a contract. And that creates a momentum and people start looking at the process differently. So I think this layer of trust covers so many different aspects of the work we do. But for me, it's really around, we need to also be trusted in knowing how we spot things that have gone wrong and being transparent when things have gone wrong and having the right mechanisms to address wrongdoings. And this is about internal wrongdoings, how we deal with those. It's also about enabling, the suppliers we work with. How can they, challenge us if they feel that a bid was awarded unfairly or that they were mistreated in a procurement process? So how do we give them the challenges to do this in a way that is meaningful? So I think there's a lot of different layers to this, and it's something that we are doing a lot of work on as the UN as a whole. But for me, it's really around how do you build the right channels to share information and to enable your counterparts to challenge you when they feel that you have done something that isn't right.
Yeah, thank you. Nadim, did you want to jump in on something there? I was going to turn to a conversation of risk.
No, I was just well, I was just thinking about the last portion, and Claire, about like just making mistakes, I guess, and also understanding when you've done something wrong. And what's most important is like just correcting that, acknowledging it, and moving forward. And that seems to be like a newer concept in our developmental field. So I just wanted to echo that. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, these are both conceptual issues, but also very tangible. I mean, they come up, I'm sure, every day in your work. And another one that I want to talk about is risk. Nadim, you talked about it a little bit when you first began. You were talking about the agency's risk appetite statement, for example. And so my question is that there are really different types of risk that have always had to be managed, whether that was explicitly acknowledged or not. There's fiduciary risk and financial, and there's security risk. There's also programmatic effectiveness risk, right? If you are if you have zero tolerance on one front, it might mean that you're sacrificing your effectiveness, which brings up another type of risk. So I want to bring this up, and it relates actually to a question that's come in as well from one of the people who's joining us and listening in and viewing this discussion. It's from Jonathan Eng, who's with USAID, who basically says, for funding agencies that are decentralized and have constant staff turnover, which I imagine both of your institutions have to deal with this, how do you create consistency across procurement staff in terms of risk tolerance, interpreting the rules, being creative when managing awards? And Nadim, you were talking about just your own sort of process of learning, and you layer more and more experiences and become better at balancing these different issues, and yet your workforce doesn't all have the same level of experience. How does that relate to these broader questions of balancing risk?
Thank you, Noam. So, one thing that comes up a lot in, say, dealing as a programmatic person with a procurement workforce is consistency in contracting or consistency in procurement. You may get one response, you may get one course of action from one contracting officer and something different from another, and that always is concerning. And always comes up as a topic. So, what I always say to that is we do have to trust our procurement professionals. For USAID, they're warranted, and they have to be able to feel confident to take the risk that may be associated with the action that they're presented with. So that evolves into a lot of gray areas, and oftentimes not necessarily say that consistency in contracting. Now, for the most part, they should all be kind of within the ballpark, right? There shouldn't be too much variance. But sometimes, someone may have more of a risk tolerance than someone else, and that should be understandable. Um, what can we do about constant turnover and ensuring that people are well informed of, say the risk appetite, as we call it, is at USAID, like I've seen this like over several years, a continuous iteration of our risk appetite statement. And the current iteration has been in place for about a year. So I think just being very vocal internally about what that means. And we have like all sorts of seminars, information sessions on our risk appetite statement, which Noam, as you've indicated, considers like a varied amount of different risks that are involved in our processes and our work. And then highlighting to especially newer people, like what's the takeaway of that statement? It's really that, as an agency, we're okay with taking a higher risk at the programmatic level because that's where we really want to see, or that's where we're going to see a lot of change, a lot of, the actions, the development that we're trying to enable happen. So the other areas, certainly, I mean, we're maybe not as high on, but due to the nature, say, of the regulations, the oversight, our reporting, but at that operational programmatic level, we're saying, hey, you know what? It's okay to take that risk, but again, that comes with some confidence and experience. So, that doesn't happen overnight for procurement professionals.
But it also strikes me that there's a play between the different types of risk, right? If you have very little risk with regard to security or finance or fiduciary issues, you, by nature of that, are impacting the ability that your programs can actually be impactful. Are you not?
No, that's a very valid point. I mean, they all kind of sink in and work together, right? So it just focusing on one is not necessarily enough. I think what I would say is like take that one that we have more of a tolerance for and build upon that. And one thing that and Claire had mentioned in a different context, but what I really liked was like building a community of practice to help, like, say, the individual like feel more confident in exercising their authority. To me, that's something that I really learned along the way. So that community of practice not only includes internal actors like, your finance officer, or even your, I would say, inspector general colleagues, but even, partners that you work with, not being afraid to say meet with them on a regular basis and engage. So that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah, thank you, Nadim. And Claire, your thoughts on sort of balancing different types of risk, and also this question from Jonathan about ensuring consistency and interpreting the rules and being creative across your workforce.
I really like this question because it's something I've been grappling with for the last year and a half since I joined UNOPS, which is around organizations that say they have a risk-based approach versus actually not having a risk-based approach. Because fundamentally, to have a truly risk-based approach, you need what Nadim was describing, which is you need the procurement community to talk to the finance community, to talk to the audit community, to talk to the project managers community, because we all need to understand the risk in the same way. As you said, if finance is placing all sorts of constraints because they view the fiduciary risk as being paramount, and at the same time you're like, yeah, but I want to work with small, medium enterprises at the local level where because of COVID, they don't have bank records from the last 3 years because their businesses went under, and yet finance is asking us to provide all sorts of paperwork for anyone bidding for a contract. There you've kind of signed up to fail because you're not actually managing the right sort of risks. So for me, there's the importance of having at the organizational level that co-created definition of risk, but also how you balance the different areas of risk out, and how you make those decisions. Then I think on the procurement community more specifically, you know, I think there's having the authority to make decisions, but ultimately being held accountable for making those decisions. And I think when it comes to, you know, policy process, especially in highly decentralized organizations, it's about how do you trust, and we go back to trust, how do you trust your local procurement officers in country to make the right decisions? And I think they're the challenge, and this might sound a little bit philosophical, is more around, well, how do you look at what's truly mandatory versus how do you make use of guidance, and how do you support and enable and empower your local procurement officers to actually make decisions? And I think the challenge there is, and there's a lot of academic, you know, research around this, the more mandatory elements you have in a policy, the more people try to find ways to work around the mandatory elements. But at the same time, if you want to rely more on guidance and less on mandatory elements, you need personnel that actually really understands what they're doing, feel empowered to make decisions, but also are trained, given the capacity development that they require through the longevity of their career, to make these guidance-based decisions. And I think that goes over to the question of, you know, turnover. If your staff is constantly turning over and you have to onboard new people and train them again, it becomes easier to move to a mandatory based, you know, framework, because there it's easier. You know, you have checklists, you have yes, no, workflows, but you're removing that flexibility and that adaptability that you can have to the local context. And I think that's where you start talking about having a risk-based approach, but fundamentally you don't, because as soon as you become very mandatory element focused, you're basically trying to alleviate all the risks, and that doesn't really work. So for me, I think that balancing act is a fine one, and I'll admit, I think the pendulum swings from one side to the other, and we very, very rarely settle in that sweet spot where you have enough, you know, mandatory policies and standards to effectively do our work, but at the same time build in enough flexibility that you can be very responsive to the need and start fostering really that culture of accountability and empowering individuals to make the right decisions. So it's a balancing act.
Well, you are both actually doing such a good job. You both have a knack for actually making procurement issues super interesting, and we all understand that they're central, which means that I have a lot of more questions. I want to actually do maybe almost a little bit of a speed round on a few questions, and I will start with this one, which is about a different lens on sustainability. But then I also want to touch on even potentially lessons from the pandemic and maybe more. So one of the, you know, we've talked a lot about the value of working with local organizations and of their capabilities and capacity being key to sustainability. And that's true for all types of local organizations. It's certainly true for private sector at the local level. But we've talked less so far about another lens on sustainability, which is more environmental sustainability. So what are you doing in terms of your procurement approaches that relate to environmental sustainability issues, and how, if at all, does it connect to issues of localization? Nadim, I'll start with you, and then we'll turn back to Anne, and then and Claire, and we'll come back to another question.
Okay, so Noam, I actually don't have a real response to that because I haven't worked at that level. But I will say that so you're asking specifically for environmental sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, it's a priority for both institutions, right? But procurement is woven into all of these different sort of values and priorities.
So I would say that in terms of environmental sustainability, I like the direction that we're going. Our administrators not only prioritized it, but we're trying to look at it more than a check the box exercise, to be, again, I have to use these words, intentional about the approach and very context specific. And I think that's the direction to go. Like, and this goes for even other portions like inclusive development, it just cannot be a check the box exercise. It has to be very context specific. That's where I feel like you get long-term gains.
Thanks. And Claire?
Yeah, I think there's a number of layers to this. One thing we do is we try to adapt. So we have sustainability criteria in all of the procurement, tenders that we do. What we try to do is adapt them to the needs of the project or the country that we're working in. So for instance, we won't necessarily look just at green procurement, but we can look at how suppliers use water if you're working in a country where, water is a scarce resource. So it's really about how do you tailor your processes to the needs of the market that you're in. The other aspect is about market maturity. If I start asking freight suppliers, I won't give you the big names, you know them all, DHL, Maersk, and the like. If I ask them, can you give me your carbon footprint? Can you show me that you're reducing it? Can you guarantee that, when I use you as a freight forwarder, my environmental impact will be lessened? They have the maturity to do that. If I ask, a furniture builder in South Sudan to give me his carbon footprint, he's going to look at me like I'm some sort of madwoman, probably not be able to answer me. And even if he could, it would be meaningless. So it all goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is about market maturity. And I think that's where that flexibility and the knowledge of procurement officers when it comes to sustainability, and especially environmental sustainability, we need to empower them to be able to think about these things, because I could make a blanket rule which says, listen, I want every supplier that tenders for our contracts to share their carbon footprint. Yeah, okay, that's not really going to achieve much in the big scheme of things, because ultimately I'm asking them for information they don't have. And even if they had it, how does that help me achieve any of my objectives? So yes, it's about tailoring. Tailoring requires skill and capacity and requires professionals who get the importance of sustainability and know how to integrate it into their everyday job.
Yeah, and I imagine also it's about how you ask the questions too, because at some level, actually, the people at the local level will have a keen understanding of how they're connected to environmental impact, just maybe not be able to answer it in the way that Maersk would, right? And yet intuitively, if you're procuring at the local level, you're saving the trans-global shipment impacts that you might have. So there are a balance between these issues. So another quick question is, over the course of the pandemic, the last few years, it's forced both of your institutions to just do things differently. And that's certainly true for how it works in contracting and procurement issues. Are there any lessons or key things that you've done differently forced by the pandemic that you really want to ensure that your organizations keep doing?
Well, I'll take a first stab, Noam. I think the pandemic for us really forced us to just work online, which is something that before the pandemic, at least for USAID, it was like almost impossible to ask us to do that, and then also to work like remotely. Like that was something that we didn't know was even possible. And then we moved to that model very quickly. Now coming out of the pandemic, just taking those best practices of kind of working in a hybrid environment, taking the best of that. And I feel like we're still kind of grappling with that. But moving that forward is really important. Also kind of harnessing new technologies within that. So we've already kind of adapted in a way that's hybrid using technology, but now like I think it demands more of it. And I guess like reviewing like what could we utilize that would be beneficial to our work? What could be automated? How could we move that forward? I think just going forward rather than backsliding in that direction. I think that's beneficial to our organization as a whole.
Thank you, Nadim. And Claire, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think like most organizations, the 100% embracing modern technologies, but also making them accessible to our colleagues in low bandwidth areas, or colleagues, who lived the pandemic in a container somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And I think that's something always worth remembering, is our experience of the pandemic sitting in the capitals of this world was very different experiencing the pandemic in some of these hardship locations that a lot of our staff and a lot of USAID staff work in. So I think there's that to be taken into consideration. But then, at the risk of sounding a little cheesy, you know, for me, the biggest lesson from the pandemic is around cooperation and just working together more effectively with our partners. I think having to react fast and efficiently and effectively and planning for the unforeseeable was a huge learning experience. And for me, one of the things I want to make sure we don't backslide on is really how do we retain that collaborative spirit that we built during the years of the pandemic and keep it moving forward, because I think it allowed a lot of us to achieve so much more in the emergency context. And if we can keep that spirit alive, I think it'll be very beneficial to us all.
Well, thank you both for your thoughts on that. And I want to close with a question, and this will be brief, from one of our viewers and listeners. Lauren Pan from the United Nations Foundation asked, what resources, and this would be UN resources, USAID reports, policies, what resources do you recommend for those of us looking to develop our own sustainable procurement policies within our organizations? You can have a real sort of imitation effect or lessons learned for many other organizations that are trying to do this. Do you have any resources that you would point to? Nadim, I'll start with you.
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I think I'm going to use Anne and Claire's community of practice. I think just learning from each other, and if I say like pointing to any resources, I would say looking at the resources that we have on our USAID website on our sustainable practices and what we're trying to prioritize. That would be, my first inclination. But I think I had and Claire and I had met earlier last week, and just hearing from another organization on how they're approaching, sustainability was really helpful. So I think more dialogue, looking at what each organization is doing, and really building that community of practice, because sustainability, we hear that word very often. It's not very easy to really look at as, okay, this is going to be what we're going to do, and this is the solution, and I have all of these approaches for you. It's an iterative process. It's context specific. It's oftentimes demand driven, and just again understanding the approach and evolving that approach as needed, because the situations always evolve and change.
Thank you, Nadim. And Anne-Claire, a last word from you before we close on this question of resources for others to draw on?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. UNOPS just launched its supplier portal, which has been revamped and has actually a lot of resources which aren't just relevant for suppliers, but which cover sustainability and a number of other things. We have our sustainable procurement framework, which is also obviously publicly available. For those of you who can access the United Nations Global Marketplace, we've actually shared UNOPS's sustainability criteria with the whole UN family to get them to try and learn from each other. The World Bank, I'm going to shamelessly plug another organization, has a lot of really good reports around the impact that procurement can have on the Sustainable Development Goals and others. But again, more of these conversations. I think that we really need to give sustainable procurement to the platform it deserves moving forward, and I think there's a lot that we can just learn from each other and learn through practice. UNOPS, we publish a lot of case studies around the work we've done in this area. I think learning from example as well, the more we can showcase each other's works and accomplishments, but also share the challenges that we've faced, I think is the best way to build our own knowledge around this.
Well, thank you both for being a part of an effort to try to give this set of issues the platform that it deserves, because it is so central to issues of global development policy and sustainability. I want to thank again Nadim Shah from USAID and Anne-Claire Howard from UNOPS for this conversation, and hopefully we will have more of the like to come. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. Take care.